For some housekeeping, my new website, nickjacomis.com, is live. It will serve primarily as home base for the podcast, as well as a place for me to occasionally share my thoughts in written form. I also have a Patreon page, which you can find by clicking the support button on the website. Thank you to those who have already shown your support. And if you don't know, there's also a YouTube channel where each of these conversations lives in video form. You can also find that through the website. My guest today is Dr. Peter Addy. Peter is a psychotherapist based out of Oregon, and he also spent a number of years as a research scientist at the Yale School of Medicine, where he studied human experiences with atypical psychedelics, such as Salvia divinorum. Salvia is quite different from classical psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. Peter and I talked about salvia, including how it works and how it's different from other psychedelics, as well as the dissociative and dysphoric effects it can have, and how his research has informed his psychotherapy practice. As always, if you enjoy the content, please consider liking, sharing, or supporting the podcast directly. And with that, here's my conversation with Dr. Peter Addy. Peter Addy, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I looked you up a while ago, and you've got a pretty interesting background. You are a therapist, I believe, but you also have quite a background in academic research. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I was postdoc and then faculty at Yale School of Medicine in a pharmacology lab and a medical informatics lab. And now I'm a therapist in private practice in Portland, Oregon.
Interesting. So how did you make that transition? What made you want to go from research into therapy? Was your research informing a therapy practice that you knew that you wanted to go into, or what happened there?
Well, it was partly on purpose and partly just sort of circumstances. I was looking at both paths for a long time. I have a PhD in clinical psychology, so I had an extensive training in a number of different clinical populations and inpatient and outpatient settings and things like that. My postdoc at Yale, I was doing research and clinical at the same time. So half of the week I would be in a lab where I would pay people to take drugs. And then the other half of the week I would go to a substance abuse clinic and counsel people who wanted to stop taking drugs. And that was a fun balance for me. So I always wanted to pursue both of those. I was very interested. But then when my family and I moved from Connecticut to Oregon about 4.5 years ago, and I thought that I was going to be able to continue my research appointment at the Department of Veterans Affairs, but that did not go as planned. And so I started to look at other opportunities, and eventually I came around to back into the clinical world from there. So part of that was not planned at all. That move was just, man, none of that went as I thought it was going to go. But then part of it was very much on purpose. I've always been much more interested in helping people individually. The research that I had been doing was not clinical research. I wasn't like working with patient populations to try to help them get better. It was basic research, trying to understand pharmacology, how substances work in the brain, which could eventually down the road be used to help people. But I was not, personally improving people's lives. And that was of interest to me. So I wanted to make that shift back into the clinical focus.
Gotcha. So when you were in your postdoc, you were seeing patients on the one side, and on the other, you were doing this basic research where you were giving people drugs. Mm-hmm. So what type of drugs were you giving them, and why did you choose to study the ones that you did?
Well, the focus of the lab that I joined has been THC. They've been doing THC research since the late 90s. So they have that down. I joined because of my expertise and interest in Salvia divinorum, which is an atypical plant-based psychedelic. And at the time, that was my doctoral research project. at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. I studied that. And then when it was time for me to graduate and look for a job, I wanted to do research. There were 2 labs in the entire world, as far as I know, that were doing human subject salvia research. Yale was one of those. Johns Hopkins was the other. So I applied to both, and I went with Yale because they were doing a salvia project. I was interested in salvia, so that was my main interest. The lab's main interest was THC, and they also researched. I helped on a project with ketamine and various research chemicals, and then shortly after I left, they started doing psilocybin research, which is very exciting.
So, for those that don't know, what is salvia, and how did you get interested in that particular plant?
Yeah, there are about 1,000 salvia plants in the world, but one particular species is called Salvia divinorum. It's native to southern Mexico. The state of Oaxaca in the highlands, the mountains there, is the only place that it grows. And it's been used by the native people, the Mazatec. They have a relationship with this plant for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. They use it in their rituals as a way to heal physical and spiritual problems, to contact their ancestors, deceased relatives, find lost objects, pray for healing. So they have a long history with this plant. This plant the leaves of it contain many, many unique chemicals that aren't found in any other plant. The most common chemical is called salvinorin A, and that is what I call an atypical psychedelic. So when we think of psychedelics, most people think about psilocybin mushrooms or LSD, and those all work on serotonin. Mm-hmm. Salvia does not work on serotonin. It does not interface with that receptor system at all. So it's not a typical psychedelic, but it has definite psychedelic-like properties. So I call it an atypical psychedelic. And I knew about it. I don't even remember how I first heard about it, probably just poking around on Arrowhead, which is a fantastic website and resource. But in my grad school, it was time for me to pick a dissertation topic. And this would have been 2007, I think. It was time for me to pick my doctoral dissertation research, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And then I read a newspaper that said that an assemblyman in the California State Senate wanted to outlaw salvia. So currently, here in 2020, as well as back in 2007, or I guess we're in 2021 now, whatever year we're in now, it's hard to tell. There are no federal laws controlling salvia, so it's state by state, and sometimes even county or town by town. So in 2007, I lived in California, and they wanted to outlaw salvia on the state level. And so I thought to myself, well, right now it's not outlawed, so I might be able to actually do some research on it. And if I don't do it, if someone doesn't do research on salvia today, pretty soon no one's going to be allowed to do research on salvia at all. So what tiny little piece can I do? What's the lowest hanging fruit? Because I don't have a lab, I don't have money, but I could do something for my doctoral dissertation. So I picked salvia. I figured better do something before it's too late.
Interesting. So it's case by case, but there's no federal laws against it. It's an unusual psychedelic. It doesn't work the way that something like LSD or psilocybin does. How do people consume it? How do people consume it in the United States today, and how is it traditionally consumed?
Yeah, in the United States today, you usually will smoke it, and you'll usually smoke the dried leaves, or more commonly, a concentrated extract of the leaves. So there's a process by which you take, I'll just make up some numbers, but let's say you take 1 kilogram of salvia leaves, and then you extract all of the salvinorin A from it, and then put it back onto, let's say, 1/10 of a kilogram of leaves. And so now that final product is 10 times as potent as the original leaf. And so usually if you go to a head shop or an online store, you're going to see salvia extracts, which are labeled as 10x or 20x or 50x. So 50 times more potent than the natural leaf. But they're probably not doing it on purpose. But the way they're labeling that is actually, it's algebra, because it's 10x, where x is an unknown variable. You don't know how potent the salvia leaf was originally. You just know that it's 10 times more potent. But 10 times what?
Yeah.
That varies over time. So it's so anyway, most people in the United States will smoke this concentrated extract. Traditionally, the Mazatec people do not. They consider that sacrilegious. That is the absolute worst thing you could do with salvia. Salvia is related to the spirits of the earth and the water, and so you don't want to add fire to water. It's just a bad combo. So traditionally, you will take fresh leaves, always in pairs, and chew them either in your. It's not absorbed in the mouth. If you were to just take like a handful of salvia leaves or even pure crystalline salvinorin A and just eat it and swallow it, it will not be absorbed into your brain. It's absorbed very well in the lungs, which is why we can smoke it, and it's absorbed in the lining in your mouth. So you can take fresh pairs of leaves and chew them and just kind of keep them in your mouth and your gums and absorb the salvinorin A that way. So the traditional route is kind of chewing or holding the leaves here, and then in the United States and Western society, or I should say Northern society, we smoke it.
Mm-hmm. And how long do the effects last so let's just stay on the traditional side for now. So it's native to the Oaxaca region of Mexico. It's used in various ritual settings there, and they're typically chewing it, holding it in their mouth. It's absorbed through the mouth. And then how would the Mazatec people describe the length and the phenomenology of the effects?
Let's see. I would say I'm going to go with 2 or 3 hours of an experience. Hard to say, exactly. It's usually done at night. The salvia spirit is timid like a deer, and bright lights and loud noises will scare her away. So you have to sit in quiet in the dark, and you have to chant or sing. This is it's participation is required. So I went to Mexico in 2014. I was part of a documentary team to learn about salvia and how the Mazatec use it, what kind of changing relationships the people have with it. And so I participated in 2 ceremonies. It's currently, salvia is considered to be connected to the Virgin Mary. So you have you go to a Catholic-like altar, and you have to first pay your respects to St. Peter. He's the gatekeeper, and St. Peter is represented by tobacco, but it's different than we think of in the West. This is fresh green tobacco leaves, which are ground up into powder. So it's not smoking or dried cured leaves, and you want to use copal smoke. Eggs, unfertilized eggs are very powerful. And so you kind of set the stage for what you want to do. When I was there, I was, in my Yale scientist hat. I was wearing that the whole time. So I was wondering, how can I take this paradigm and kind of squeeze it into the Western reductionistic science paradigm, which, of course, is a fool's errand. But I wanted to see if there was any kind of overlap or what people were doing there. No one in Mazatec cultures are holding the DSM and trying to look at mental disorders. So it's kind of silly for me to think that I could go down and do something like that. But I wanted to just kind of see what sort of overlap or patterns there might be. So you go in there at night, usually you and the healer the curandero will take salvia together, rather than the Western paradigm where the patient takes the drug and the doctor, remains aloof. So you take this together and you sing or chant to the saints and to God and the angels sometimes, and then you have an experience. This was, for me at least, I was sitting up in a chair the whole time, and in the dark, like I couldn't see if someone was sitting right next to me. I wouldn't have been able to notice. And then you kind of have an experience, and the healer who's kind of leading things kind of determines when it's over. And also the pharmacological effects last maybe 2 hours. So that's also part of it. And then it's over. And then you can talk about it, you can rest, and just kind of have some reflection afterwards. You have to really purify yourself before and after. So in terms of avoiding certain kinds of food, avoiding all sexual interactions for 40 days before and after. So this is in order to purify your body and your soul so that you can more appropriately commune with the divine. And if you don't do that, if you don't follow these rules, then it can lead to what we might call a bad trip or madness, or your soul leaving and not coming back. So very important stuff.
So the broad strokes here are somewhat similar to the way people describe an ayahuasca ceremony, where there's this purification and abstinence from eating certain foods that happens. Usually it's described in the religious or spiritual framework of the local populations, but also in the case of ayahuasca, you've got an MAOI, which is a drug that can affect the metabolism of drugs and can also pose a danger if you're eating certain foods. So is there something similar going on with salvia and the active ingredients? Is there any known effect on metabolism that might pose a risk?
Not in that way. So certainly if you're eating a bunch of bacon and then you take an MAO inhibitor, you can have a pretty unpleasant experience. So in the case of ayahuasca, there are certainly physiological reasons for some of the dieta, but not so with salvinorin A. It does not affect any stomach enzymes or CYP metabolism or anything like that. But even with the ayahuasca dietas as well, it's more than just a physiological reaction. So avoiding, again, like sexual contact, or depending on how you prepare the meat, some meat might have high levels of tyramine, which you don't want to mix with MAO inhibitors, but fresh lean meats you could eat, but they still often will say just to avoid meat entirely. So it's more about a spiritual or a psychological cleansing.
And so you said the effects last approximately 2 hours. It's in the dark. What's the phenomenology like? Are you completely disassociated from your surroundings? Are there visual hallucinations? What kinds of phenomena do you experience?
Yeah, it's not, there are some visual distortions or hallucinations that can happen, especially with closed eyes, but that's not really the primary piece of it. So certainly if you ask someone about ayahuasca or LSD, they will probably talk to you a lot about their visual experiences. And that happens with salvia, but in my research, I would ask, my first project, I recruited 30 people, and I had them self-administer one of these concentrated extracts, and I just sat next to them holding space. And then when you smoke it, we're talking traditionally, but just when you smoke it, it lasts much shorter. It's 10 or 15 minutes. And so then I would ask them afterwards, what happened? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you taste? And sure, they reported some visual experiences, but it was much more of a kind of a mental experience when you, and also a physiological or a body experience. So traditionally, people will be able to see things like you're going up a mountain path in order to see St. Peter at the top, something like that. And so, like you can kind of visualize that that's happening, but it's more of a, maybe like imagination.
Mm-hmm.
I can, when I'm reading a book, I can close my eyes and just sort of picture the scenes that are happening in the book, but that's not really a visual experience. So it's more of a mental or a cognitive experience.
I see. And so when people are smoking or vaporizing the concentrated extract, it's a much shorter duration. And what do we know about the biology there? So you said it's an atypical psychedelic, so it's not acting on serotonin 2A receptors like something like LSD would, but it is interfacing with other receptor systems. And what do we know about what's going on there?
All right. Salvinorin A is a potent and selective kappa opioid receptor agonist. So it works on one receptor site and only one. LSD works on something like 20. Psilocybin, 10 or 15. Salvinorin A only does one thing, and it does that one thing very well. It is an agonist. It increases activity at the kappa opioid receptor. There are 3 opioid receptors, at least 3, maybe more, but definitely 3 of them: delta, mu, and kappa. And if you think about opioids like heroin or fentanyl, those are going to be very strong mu and delta agonists. And when you increase activity on delta and mu receptors, you get pleasure and pain relief, and things feel very good. And along with that, unfortunately, you get abuse liability and this reinforcing effects. Salvinorin A doesn't do that. It doesn't feel good, and it's not reinforcing. It's not habituating. It's kind of the opposite. When you activate the kappa receptor system, it leads to, and the clinical term is dysphoria instead of euphoria. So things don't feel great, and you can feel kind of distanced or dissociated from people. One person in my study said that he was fully aware of everything going on in the room around him, but it was as if he was looking through a cardboard tube, or like looking through binoculars backwards, where it's there, but it's just farther away. It's potent. It's the most potent naturally occurring psychedelic we know of. It's a full-on psychedelic experience. What we do in the research world is we want to give people about 1 milligram. That's something like 20 times more potent than the psilocybin molecule. The only thing more potent than that is LSD, which is active. A full psychedelic dose of LSD is going to be about 1/4 of a milligram. So salvinorin A, very small amounts of this molecule will affect your consciousness in very obvious, profound ways. I mean, I said that the visual component isn't primary, but you still, you can leave your body, forget that you ever had a body. You can travel through time, you can travel through space, you can be pulled into multiple different dimensions all at once, where you're contacting the dead or aliens, and all sorts of things happen through a very, very small amount of this molecule. And that's fascinating to me.
So it sounds like the salvinorin A, so it's unique in that it's not a typical psychedelic, it's selective. So it's only interacting with this one receptor. It's an opioid receptor, but it's not an opioid in the way that more famous drugs, perhaps traditional pain-killing opioids, are working. So it's a different kind of opioid interaction. And when it's inhaled, it's a short duration experience that's very intense. And based on your description now, it sort of sounds like DMT in some ways, in terms of maybe the intensity and the duration, but perhaps different, which makes sense given the very different mechanism of action. So where in the brain are these kappa opioid receptors? Are they all over the place? Are they in very specific locations? Do we know where the brain is being affected?
Yeah, we can see that. The parts of the brain that I've been most interested in are particularly the basal ganglia, which is the reward circuitry. So when you take morphine or cocaine and it feels good, or to a lesser extent when you're on one of your free-to-play games on your phone and it gives you those little hits, that's it. Those things are designed very purposefully to hit the reward centers of your brain, and you just want to keep coming back for more and then spend real money to get your fake money in the game. And that all works on the basal ganglia. So there are a lot of opioid receptors of all types in the basal ganglia. There's also, so that there we see morphine and cocaine and things like that. They increase dopamine levels in the reward circuitry, which again, that feels good. Dopamine in the reward circuitry is very pleasurable. Dopamine in other parts of the brain may not feel so pleasurable, but in the basal ganglia, yeah, that's great. You want more of that. So salvinorin A, on the other hand, decreases dopamine levels in the basal ganglia. So again, it's not rewarding. It's not addictive. It's not something that you want to keep doing. There are also a lot of kappa opioid receptors in two areas of the brain that I'd never heard of in grad school or in any of my trainings. I came across some of this stuff trying to figure out what is salvia doing. And it is probable, this is just theoretical at this point, but it's likely that salvinorin A strongly affects the claustrum and the insular cortex. So these two areas have high concentrations of kappa receptors and relatively low concentrations of delta and mu receptors. So again, morphine is probably not disrupting or affecting these areas too much. The insular cortex is in charge of interoception, which we can talk more about that, but that's basically your sense of your body in space. I think of in the first Matrix film, Neo goes back into the Matrix after they yank him out, and in the real world, Neo is has a shaved head and he's just wearing rags and eating protein goo. But then he goes back into the Matrix and suddenly he has hair and clothes again, and he looks as he expects himself to look. And so he says to Morpheus, where did this come from? This isn't real. And my brain knows that this isn't real. And Morpheus says, well, you have an expectation of what you think you look like. You think that you have hair and that you wear clothes, even though you know you don't. And so interoception is like that I think I know what my body is doing. And if I'm upright or horizontal, things like that, if I know that I'm hungry, just what my organs are doing, if I have a full bladder or not. These senses, all these sensations are kind of grouped together as interoception, and that is put together in the insular cortex.
I see. So interoception, it's really the perception your brain has of the internal world, your body, and what it's doing, and all of your insides. So you mentioned the insula and the claustrum. Where approximately, for people that don't know, where in the brain is that? Well,
they're all kind of in the middle. The basal ganglia and the claustrum and the insular cortex are like right next to and kind of connected with the basal ganglia. And it's kind of deep in there. I can't really point at it because it's close to the middle. I have never been great with neuroanatomy. I've never, apparently if you go to med school, you can actually play with brains. I never got to do that. So I couldn't really tell you more than that, but it's pretty deep down in there. It's not a surface structure.
Interesting. And then the claustrum I know is a kind of mysterious and also famous part of the brain. So what is known about that? Do we know anything about the normal function of the claustrum? Is it similar to the insula?
Well, we're guessing. We don't really know. But one idea is it's been referred to perhaps as the conductor of consciousness. So it doesn't generate consciousness because there's no one thing that generates consciousness. It's a very complex interplay of 100 different things, but perhaps the claustrum is involved in coordinating all of those disparate pieces in some way. One of the reasons that we don't know is because it's small and it's pretty deep in there, so it's hard to image it. Like, we can't get that good of resolution in PET scans, and it's deep in there, so it doesn't get damaged very often, which normally is great just for human beings running around the world. But a lot of what we know about how the brain works is when it stops working. So when someone gets lesions, when Phineas Gage got a stake through his brain back in the day, that was like the first neuroscience experiment. And so if we can't damage a brain region, then we can't learn how it works by its lack of. So we can't get in there and damage not yours, but a rat's or an animal's insular cortex or claustrum, and they're very small and all kind of bunched up next to each other. So I'm told we can't really get good imaging resolution for it. So a lot of this is based on guesswork, where these things connect to, what they connect to, and what connects to them. And we can get a sense of receptor densities in animals. At least it's easier.
Wow. So these areas, so the insula and the claustrum, they're tucked in the brain. They're responsible in some ways for your sense of your internal world. So interoception as opposed to exteroception, like, light hitting your retina from the outside of the body. They've got these opioid receptors, these kappa opioid receptors, but they don't have the other opioid receptors that something like morphine or heroin are going to act on that cause pleasure. They've got these other receptors, and they're causing dysphoria rather than euphoria. People don't want to do them again. And, I've been around a number of people who've tried salvia, and no one comes out of the experience saying, I'll have another one. It's usually described as a very bizarre, not necessarily terrifying or overtly negative, but certainly not pleasurable experience. People always say that was just weird. And it causes dissociative effects. So does all this mean that it could have potential for treating something like addiction? You've almost described it as sort of an anti-opioid or something.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research in synthetic kappa agonists as potential treatments for addiction and pain. As far as I know, salvinorin A is the only naturally occurring kappa agonist, selective kappa agonist, I should say. And before we knew that, that was not discovered until 2002. So before that, scientists had created synthetic kappa agonists in the lab, and they thought that this might be a great way to treat pain or addiction without those pesky addictive side effects. Because usually, like with morphine, if something treats pain, it also has an addictive property. It's really hard to disentangle those two, and that's kind of the holy grail of pain management, is to find something that manages pain without addiction. And a kappa agonist might do that. But in these human trials, they saw that it leads to dysphoria and sometimes hallucinations. So it's not fun. It's not like a euphoric kind of pleasurable experience, but it is, in the clinical trial jargon, they would say these are adverse effects. And if you're just trying to treat someone's pain and they start hallucinating, then that is not a good idea. It's not beneficial. So those trials never really went anywhere.
Take us back to your research. So you were administering salvia to people. How are they consuming that? Was it the concentrated extract, or was it simply the leaves? Like, what was the dosage and the concentration of what you administered?
I wanted generalizability or ecological validity. So people out in the street are using like a 10x, like a concentrated extract. So that's what I wanted to use. One of the leading salvia researchers in the world is Daniel Siebert in Malibu, California. He's kind of an independent scientist, and he has his own salvia shop where he has extracts that are standardized. So it's not just 10 times an unknown value. It's these have been standardized to contain approximately, I forgot the exact number. I think it was 1,037 micrograms, some number like that. So I used that. So it's a concentrated extract, but it's standardized so that everyone gets the same amount. And then I also bought an equivalent amount of just plain old dried salvia leaf, which I then weighed and cut up into individual portions for a placebo dose, or what you might call an ultra low dose. And 25 milligrams of plant material. That's very small. So 25 milligrams of salvia leaf, you're not going to have an experience. That's not going to be psychoactive. It's just too small. But 25 milligrams with that extract put on top of it, yes, you're going to have a full-blown experience there. So I used that. Part of the approval process at my school, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, was that I am not qualified to administer drugs to people. So they did it themselves. I just kind of handed them a pipe and a lighter and the capsule, and they did their own thing. And I just sat there and watched, basically. We had an emergency medical technician or a nurse to check them out before and after, and sat in the next room just in case. There was no just in case. We never needed that, but it's good to be there. I had 30 people go in twice, so a placebo dose and a high dose, random, counterbalanced, double-blind conditions. I wanted very much for them to have a relaxing, inward-focused experience. So we were in a very nice, comfortable room with soft lighting. They got to sit in a recliner with their feet up. I gave them a mindfold, or I think it was just a blindfold, but they were encouraged to close their eyes or just kind of look inward. I practiced a body scan relaxation script. We had classical music playing in the background. So everything I could think of was set for people to just feel at peace and relaxed and wanting to look in. And then they inhaled on their own, closed their eyes, and fell back. And then if an outside observer had looked in, most of the time it would seem like I'm just kind of sitting there staring off into the distance while someone next to me is taking a nap. Most of the time they just kind of laid there and didn't really do anything until 15 or 20 minutes later. They would kind of come back on their own. And then I had a set of questions, which mostly it was just, let's go through the senses. What did you see? What did you hear? What did you smell, etc.? What was your experience like? That was my main focus. I wanted to just get the phenomenology of it. Where do you go and what happens to you?
And who were these people? Were they college students? Had they tried it before? Had they not tried it before?
Inclusion criteria, you had to have experience with a psychedelic, which I defined rather broadly. You did not have to have experience with salvia, and I want to say about a third of the population did. So maybe 10 out of 30 had used salvia in the past. But everyone had used some kind of psychedelic, I think most frequently mushrooms. Adults, just anyone I could find in the Bay Area, I'd say probably half of them were either went to my school or knew someone, or were like, a family member of someone who went to my school. So it was a convenient sample. The only kind of strict thing that I was looking for is I wanted half men and half women. At the time, I assumed gender to be binary, so I just wanted, half and half.
Interesting. So, and this was in California. So it actually is it still legal in California? Approximately how many states would you say it's legal or unregulated in?
Well, in California, so they when I heard that this law was being debated, I dipped my toes into activism for the first time. I contacted my representative, I contacted the bill's author, everyone involved in the committee who was going to look at it. I called, I sent them like paper copies of letters and the articles. I said, don't trust me. Here's the research studies themselves. And don't outlaw salvia. It's a bad idea. And they did not pass the bill. So success. The next year, he wrote just a modified version of the bill to make it illegal to sell to children. And that did pass. So currently in California, you can't sell it to children, but you can sell it to adults. Here in Oregon, I don't think there's any age restrictions. I think it's available to anyone. In Connecticut, where I did most of my work, it was completely illegal. They outlawed it the same year that I moved there in 2011. So it varies widely. As far as how many states, I haven't kept track recently, to be honest with you. But last time I checked, which was probably 4 or 5 years ago, I think that it was completely 100% illegal in, I want to say, 12 states.
Gotcha. So some states it's completely legal. Some states it's legal and regulated in terms of the age you need to be to buy it. And in some states it's wide open.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And so you're doing this research. It's having all of these interesting effects. It's not addictive, which is something that's true for pretty much all psychedelics. What about toxicity? Is there any risk of organ damage, or is there any physical toxicity?
Not that we've been able to see. There certainly isn't as much research there as I would prefer, but there's been, the only tox studies have been done in rodents, and there's no indication whatsoever. And especially because of how you have to take it. If you're smoking even something like a 100x extract, like you would have to smoke a lot of that in order to like overload your system with it. And if you think about the traditional way where you're just holding leaves in your mouth, like you just cannot physically there's a limit on how many leaves you can put in there at once. So it seems very unlikely that anyone would ever overdose in the kind of standard sense of that term. So we don't know of any obvious danger or like medical contraindications.
Interesting. So, and it's also a dissociative. So, something like psilocybin or LSD are not considered dissociatives. They're considered classical psychedelics. Something like ketamine is typically discussed as a dissociative. What is dissociation? How would you describe that as a psychologist? And does that have anything? It must have something to do with these kappa opioid receptors and interoception, the sense of your own body, right? But how would you define dissociation?
That's a good one. I mean, I could, I'm sure the DSM has a definition of it, but I couldn't quote that for you. As it shows up in my practice, dissociation is where you, maybe in a more extreme case, you do something and don't remember it afterwards, or something happens to you and you observe it as if from the outside. But those are extreme cases. More commonly, what I see with my clients is that you're kind of not really aware of what you're doing, just that you're kind of preoccupied. I try to, since COVID hit, there's nowhere for me to go, but I at least like to go for walks in my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I will leave the door and then I will blink and suddenly I am 5 blocks away from my house and I have no idea how I got there because I've just been in my mind. I've been thinking about my grocery list or what clients I have that day or a project I'm working on. And I'm just a little dissociated from that. I was not at all aware of my experience. Other times I'll go for a walk and I'll leave my house and I can really pay attention to the sights and the sounds and the smells. The Pacific Northwest in the fall is one of the best smelling places I've ever been, especially right before or right after it rains, which is very often. It rains a lot here. And just noticing flowers and dogs, and some of my neighbors have chickens in the yard. And so sometimes I can really pay attention to all of that. And other times I'm dissociated and I have no idea what's going on. And then suddenly I come to 10 minutes later.
And so what, as part of your clinical practice as a psychologist, what would you say are the major ways that dissociation manifests itself in pathological cases? What does someone typically look like when they have a negative form of dissociation that is preventing them from functioning at their full potential?
Well, one of my clients struggles with alcohol use. And so he might say, I'm not going to drink today. And then he comes home from work, and then suddenly there's a beer in his hand. And he didn't decide, I'm going to walk to the fridge, I'm going to open the door, I'm going to pull out the beer, find the can open, the bottle opener. It just sort of happened. And often at that point, for many people, once you've had one, you might as well have 2 or 12 at that point, which is a cognitive distortion. You can, in fact, stop after 1, but it's very difficult to do that. So, but stopping that first one, that's really what we want to do. That's the goal. And he didn't decide to drink a beer. Mm-hmm. It just sort of happened.
Interesting. So, in neuroscience, you often make a distinction between top-down and bottom-up processing. So bottom-up would be just normal sensation. So you're walking around and you're really tuned into the sensory experience that's coming into you. You're walking and smelling the smells in the Pacific Northwest, feeling your own footsteps against the pavement. You're really paying attention to the present moment and the sensations that are coming into your brain. And then top-down processing would be what we normally think of as higher order cognitive control, deciding to do something through planning ahead of time, imagining the future and planning your movements in anticipation of something that's not there yet. And so it almost sounds like dissociation is somehow related to this, where you're not tuned into the bottom-up, moment-by-moment sensations as much as you might need to be, and you're somehow lost in thought, or there's too much top-down processing going on, such that in the case of your client, something happens, in this case grabbing a beer or a drink, and you're not aware of the actual bottom-up sensations of doing that while they're happening. Does that sound like it's in the ballpark of how you might describe neurologically what is going on here?
Seems reasonable. I'm not sure about what kind of neurological underpinnings people have come up with, but that makes sense. I do know that disruptions in interoceptive ability have been well documented in depression and substance use and body dysmorphic disorders. So it was really mind-opening for me to realize that it's not, when we think of interoception, it's not yes or no. Mm-hmm. So in the example I gave, I'm just sort of a zombie walking through my neighborhood. There's no signals, or there are signals, but I'm just not they're not coming up into consciousness. Mm-hmm. But it's not just that. The missing piece is that you can, so for instance, the example, right now, I don't notice my heart beating. It is in fact beating, but I'm not aware of it. If I were to, touch my chest or my wrist or something, I could feel it, but I don't normally just feel my heart beating. So there's no interoceptive signals. Someone who has an anxiety disorder has heightened interoception. They've got really good awareness of their body signals, but they also, it's not just the signal, it's the emotional valence that you put on that. So someone with an anxiety disorder, they're just sitting around minding their own business, and they start feeling their heart beating in their chest, and they say, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack. Mm-hmm. I need to go to the hospital. So they feel that, and then they put an emotional thing on it, which just exacerbates anxiety, and it just kind of snowballs from there. So it's not just paying attention to your heartbeat or not, it's also the emotion that you add to it. So how, depression, anxiety, some disorders like that, we see altered interoceptive ability, where it's either the awareness of your body signals and or the emotions that you ascribe, kind of the story that you tell yourself about those body signals.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've also seen how it's not just in psychiatric disorders that we see altered interoception, but we also see how certain psychological interventions can specifically improve interoceptive abilities, particularly mindfulness meditation, yoga, tai chi, things like that, that you're increasing your ability to understand and be in relationship with your body.
Gotcha. That makes perfect sense. Those are really practices where you're using your body and you're paying attention to exactly how you're using it and what it feels like. And that was actually going to be my next question, is how do you train this ability to stay aware of immediate sensation and what's going on immediately in your sensory environment? Is that the main way? Do you talk about neurological mechanisms with your patients? Are there other techniques in addition to those physical practices?
Well, it is mostly physical practices. I mean, the more I do and learn about talk therapy, the more convinced I am that talk therapy isn't always so great, especially with trauma. You can't talk your way out of trauma. My clients who have panic attacks, you don't talk yourself into a panic attack. So you can't talk yourself out of it. It's a physiological response. So I've been learning a lot more about vagus nerve theory and more of the somatic based psychotherapies that you can just work directly on your body, and you can kind of bypass the thinking and feeling brain entirely. Sometimes the thing to do is just work on your nervous system, and you don't have to talk about it.
Interesting. And how effective would you say that is for a lot of people? Or does it really vary? Do some people respond or naturally conduct meditation practice more readily than they would more intensive exercise routine or more intensive yoga practice?
There's a lot of variables for sure. I used to answer the phone lines for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and I could hear people, like, all I have is a voice. I don't know what their faces look like or anything. And I could tell that they're breathing very rapidly. And that'll give anyone a panic attack. If you just get the most chill person around and you get them to start taking a lot of short, shallow breaths where they're not really getting any oxygen and the CO2 starts to build up, anyone is going to feel anxiety from doing that. So I want people to take slow, deep breaths to just regulate their nervous system and be able to actually have a conversation. Some people are gasping in such a way that they can barely get words out. So I just literally cannot talk to you if you're breathing like that. And sometimes that helps really well. Most of the time that helps a lot. And if I could get someone on the phone to breathe with me, I'd do it with them. And if we can just breathe together for 60 seconds, that's really all it takes to slow down, to feel more settled and more regulated so that we can have a conversation about what's going on in your life. But sometimes, minority of the time, it makes things worse. And I'm not sure why, but I think that because again, I only have a voice to go on. If I were in the room with a person, I'm guessing that I can help, like I can give you a timer. I can say, breathe in, breathe out. And, I can just kind of time it to a second hand on a clock, but I don't know what they're doing with their bodies. So my guess is that some people, maybe they're so distraught or they have a low interoceptive ability that they just don't really know where their lungs are at that time. So I might say, take a deep breath, and they're thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to take a deep breath. And they take a shallow breath because they just literally don't know what's going on in their chest and torso at that moment. And so in that case, what ends up happening is that I'm kind of encouraging them, or they're encouraging themselves to hyperventilate, which is not good.
Interesting. So this interoceptive ability seems to be crucial. If you're not able to pay attention and get a good signal from the inside of your body, it literally can prevent you from physically helping yourself.
Yeah. A lot of my work now is with people with chronic pain and related chronic health conditions. I have a chronic pain condition. And so there, paying attention to my body equals pain. So I don't want to do that. That's the last thing I want. I want to dissociate in order to just get through the day. And so if you're asking me to like do a body scan or pay attention to all my muscles, that's excruciating. That is, I will just run out of the room rather than do that. So getting someone to pay attention to their body there is very difficult. Understandably so. It's a survival mechanism to not pay attention to your pain. But what I try to tell myself, what I try to tell my clients is that long term, you get to pay attention to your body. And also there's that emotional balance piece where you get to then have a sense of the pain it's just pain. Like pain doesn't have to be bad, which is a weird thing. Like I don't think I fully grasp that, to be honest with you, but I try. It's a practice. But sometimes you can get to the point where pain is just pain. It's just there. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing, but it's just part of it.
Yeah, so it sounds like the real optimal psychological toolkit is not one where you've got interoception tuned up all the way, or one where you've kind of got the opposite, but it's actually the ability to selectively turn up or turn down interoception versus external attention when it best suits you. If you've got intense pain, you might actually want to dissociate a bit to literally dissociate yourself from the feeling of pain. And in other cases, you might be dissociating, and that's actually preventing you from knowing what you're actually doing, like grabbing that next drink.
Yeah, I would say decoupling the body signals from your story about the body signals. A lot of times, so I'm going to guess with my my client who reaches for the beer unconsciously, if I were able to peek into his head, I'm going to guess that he comes home from work and he starts thinking about a lot of stressful things. He's having trouble in his marriage, and money's pretty tight. And so he comes home from work and he's just kind of flooded with all of these things. And so to avoid the emotional pain, he reaches for alcohol, which in the short term is very good at its job of avoiding the emotional pain. It's a terrible long-term solution, but in the moment, it's pretty good. I come home and I start thinking about all these terrible things in my life, and I want to avoid that pain, so I'll drink. And a long-term goal would then be to notice physical or emotional pain and to decouple that from having to do something about it, or having to just habitually numb it or medicate from it, because it's just there. It's just a thing that you can look at like anything else. It's not overwhelming. It's not going to destroy you.
And so if we kind of go back to the phenomenon of addiction, so let's talk about something like drug addiction. We kind of touched on the opioid receptor system and how it's really hard to dissociate the effects of something like an opioid painkiller from the addictive potential that those have, because getting rid of the pain is very closely related to the circuits that are actually generating pleasure, right? Drugs of abuse feel good. That's a big part of why they're reinforcing and addictive. We talked about dissociation a little bit and how that could be related to regulating or not regulating your behavior appropriately. So as a psychological phenomenon, how do you think about addiction and how it actually starts and grabs a hold of someone?
That's a big question. I mean, that's a whole 2-hour conversation. But addiction to, drugs or gambling or sex or anything, there's something that I don't want to see. And so my body is in pain and I don't want to see that. So I use morphine or alcohol, or whatever it is. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But sometimes we get so enamored with the thing that we use to avoid the pain that we forget about the pain. Or I could say that better, but morphine can be a wonderful tool. But if we just look at that all the time and forget about the other thing, then it becomes dangerous. So if I say, I'm in a lot of pain, but I have a lot of work to do today, and I just need to kind of get through the day and see my clients or, do an interview or something like that, then, I could take something, or I'm feeling tired, so I'm going to drink some coffee, right? Coffee's addictive. You go through withdrawal, you build up tolerance. It meets all the classic criteria. It's an addictive drug. But I'm feeling tired and I got an interview to do, so I'm going to drink a cup of coffee. That's not bad. Nothing wrong with that. But then once the coffee wears off, do I think about my energy in other ways? Let me eat some healthy protein to give myself a better energy burst. Let me take some time to think about my sleep schedule, my bedtime and my wake up routine. Like, can I look at the bigger picture? Like, why am I feeling tired in the first place? Like, let me actually look at that. And I could use caffeine as kind of a temporary boost to help me cook some food or, rearrange my bedroom, buy some blackout curtains, whatever it is, which in the long term is a way better way to manage my energy. And that's healthy. And a less healthy thing is I feel tired, so I'm going to drink coffee. And now I'm not tired anymore, so I don't have to do any more work.
Interesting. And so, right now addiction is front and center in a lot of people's minds just because there's so much of it going on these days, whether it's opioid addiction or any number of other things. This is probably being exacerbated by the current situation we faced in 2020. So when you think about addiction treatments, there's a lot of stuff going on today that's very exciting in terms of addiction treatments. You've got, people talking about psychedelics ranging from psilocybin to ibogaine. Is there any work being done on the potential usefulness of salvia? On salvia for addiction treatment?
Not that I know of. There has been in the past. So the closest, there have been no clinical trials for salvia for anything. So all the human research to date has been basic research where we're just trying to learn what it's doing, either to your experience or to your brain. But there have been some case reports. So Australia, there's a psychiatrist named Dr. Haynes in Australia, and he published 2 case series where he was seeing patients with treatment-resistant depression, and his client, just all on her own, started taking salvia in what we might today call a microdose, that she would take doses of salvia maybe twice a week that were not psychoactive or just a little bit, barely psychoactive, and her depression's cured. And so he encountered that. I think he wrote about 8 people, I think, who did that. And then Australia became the first country to outlaw salvia. So there's no more case reports coming out of there. That's depression, not substance abuse. But I think that there might be some, since there's similar mechanisms there for a lot of reasons, I think it's likely that that microdosing or taking salvia in a mindful way might help someone who has either depression or addiction. But we don't actually know. Like, there's no actual like research or writing about that in humans. In the animal literature, it's a much clearer picture that, yeah, absolutely, that's going to help. You give, you get non-human primates or rodents addicted to cocaine, and then you treat them with salvinorin A, and they no longer reach for the lever that pushes they no longer push the cocaine button. Once you can kind of, there's a few different paradigms where you can kind of pre-treat with salvinorin A, and the salvinorin kind of blocks the rewarding effects of the cocaine, or you can kind of give the monkey cocaine and then stop, so they're back to baseline, but they're kind of primed to want the cocaine, and then you give them salvia or cocaine or both, and it's less pleasurable because you can kind of detect pleasure based on behavior and dopamine release. So there's a few different paradigms for it, but in the animal research, it seems pretty clear that salvia can help with addiction, but in humans, we haven't really seen that yet, but it seems reasonable to suspect.
Interesting. So there's that animal research out there that indicates that potential. Are there any other, so this is a selective kappa opioid receptor agonist. So salvia is this kind of weird special drug. It's not a typical psychedelic. It has this unique property where it's binding to a particular opioid receptor. And you mentioned earlier that there was a synthetic opioid drug that had a similar pharmacological profile. Is there anything in use in humans in terms of synthetic kappa opioid receptor agonists or anything like that?
Well, actually, there's a ton of them. I had mentioned I don't even remember the names now, but in the 80s, people had created some like selective kappa agonists to try out, and those trials never really went anywhere. But we didn't know it at the time, but we found out much later that a lot of tricyclic antidepressants have kappa agonist properties. So before the age of Prozac, the most popular antidepressants were a class of drugs called tricyclics, such as amitriptyline, imipramine, things like that. And they're not used so much these days, but they are still used, and they were the go-to antidepressant for a long time. And those are primarily serotonin agonists. I think they work on SERT, but I don't remember. But so they're mostly, the thing they do is serotonin. But we found out more recently, maybe 5 years ago, that they also have kappa agonist properties. And so there's a huge amount of people who have been using kappa agonists to treat their depression. They just didn't know about it.
Interesting. So why was there that move from the tricyclics to the SSRIs, I think in the 90s? What did they have side effects that were not popular?
Yeah, there can be more of a sedative effect than Prozac. Man, it's been a while, but certainly there's kind of a 2-book series. There's, of course, Listening to Prozac, and forgot who wrote that. And then as a counterpoint to it is the book Talking Back to Prozac, which I think is by Peter Breggin, if I remember right. But these 2 books offer kind of 2 diverging points as to like why Prozac changed the landscape in the way it did. And there are a lot of factors, including things like Prozac you can patent, and a lot of the tricyclics were coming off patent. So money is certainly a big factor, but also the side effect profile and just the level of effectiveness, that anytime when a new drug comes on market, it is really effective. And then over time, it becomes less effective. And we see that for a variety of psych drugs. And so in the early 90s or late 80s, I forgot when Prozac hit the scene now, but it's the hot new thing. And so it's hugely effective. And nowadays, Prozac's been around for a long time, and people don't really prescribe it very much. None of my clients are on Prozac. They're all on like the newest, the hottest and latest antidepressants.
Is that because when something's new, there's this expectation that the new thing is the best thing, and so maybe the placebo effect is even stronger than it otherwise would be? Or is it because when people take SSRIs for a long time, their body and their physiology actually adapts to the drug?
Both.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And then, so with something like SSRIs, they've been so common. What do you know about the effectiveness of those standard treatments for depression? So like a big area right now in psychedelic drug research is, everything about psilocybin, for example. And one of those is end of life anxiety. And another one that's related is major depression, especially depression that might be refractory, that's not responded well to other treatments. How effective are things like SSRIs? What percentage of people that have an SSRI with therapy are actually going to recover from major depression? And what percentage approximately are not going to respond well to that?
I don't know. I'm sure there's a ton of reviews and meta-analyses out there, but I honestly couldn't tell you.
Interesting.
I know that I could say that this is kind of the difference between a lab and the real world, efficacy versus effectiveness. That what I usually see is that a psychiatrist, or nowadays it's usually your PCP prescribes an antidepressant, and then that's it. Which was never the plan. It's not supposed to happen like that. It's supposed to be an antidepressant plus therapy, but that's not what we actually see in the real world. So that's going to reduce effectiveness quite a bit, I'm sure. Whereas in a research trial, if you get individualized care and you get an SSRI plus therapy, and a lot of people asking how you're doing and doing a phone check-in with you once a week or once a day or whatever it is for several months, then you're getting a lot of great support, and there's going to be a much higher efficacy in the lab because of that. And then in the real world, you just sort of, here's some Zoloft, go live your life. And that's not going to work as well.
Gotcha. So this phenomenon of drugs being less effective over time could in part be something like that. In the beginning, you're supposed to have psychotherapy plus the drug, like the SSRI. And if more and more people are just getting that script from their psychiatrist and never actually going into the therapy, they're never really getting the full treatment that they should have been getting the whole time. Yeah.
And I fear that psychedelics will fall into that same trap. If you just say, here, have a psychedelic experience. And even if it's under, controlled, well-done conditions, here in Oregon, we're going to be able to offer psilocybin services in 2 years. Super excited about that. But it might be. So the way the law is written is that you have to have one preparation session and then one medicine session. And then you have to offer one integration session. You don't even have to do it. You just have to offer it. And so just kind of doing that, people could kind of come in and out, and you could just churn clients through that like a factory. And that's not ideal for many reasons, but it's the same sort of thing. Like it's Prozac plus therapy is better than just throwing Prozac at a problem. And so psilocybin assisted psychedelic therapy, or psilocybin, the Oregon law doesn't call it therapy. I think they call it services, psilocybin services. So having a psilocybin service, and then that's it, I think is going to be much less effective than psilocybin plus support, plus therapy, or a spiritual community or something.
Do you think there's like a fundamental conflict between the economic and financial structures of mental health care services and our ability to actually use a lot of these medicines the right way? So basically you just described, situations where you might take a medication, whether it's a psychedelic or anything else. You might take it in the context of therapy, but for maximum effectiveness, maybe you need to be going to therapy for weeks or even months and have therapy sessions both with and without the medication to have the integration sessions after using the psychedelic, for example, to do it almost like MAPS does the MDMA studies for PTSD, where there's actually many weeks of therapy and you're only getting the drug once or twice, and it's interspersed within this 6 or 8 plus week therapy sessions. But in the real world, outside of the clinical trials, there's probably an incentive to churn through as many patients as quickly as possible. And so is there basically two things rubbing up against each other there?
Oh man, now you're getting me riled up. So first of all, you said something about like doing this the right way.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no right way to take psilocybin or salvia or any of these things. Mm-hmm. There are absolutely wrong ways. So taking mushrooms and then driving a car, that is the wrong way to take mushrooms. Don't do that. But there's no right way to do this. The Mazatec don't own it. Pharmaceutical companies don't own it. There's 100 different ways to take these medicines. I've been last year in 2020, I've been getting into Allen Ginsberg's poetry again. His most famous poem is Howl. It's phenomenal. I can't recommend it highly enough, especially the footnote. You got to read it with the fourth part. Ginsberg and Kerouac took mescaline and wandered around San Francisco and had a psychedelic experience, which Ginsberg turned into the poem Howl.
Was this in the 60s?
Yeah, early 60s. And it's a profound experience. And that had nothing to do with the DSM, mental health, research studies. That wasn't medical in any way. And yet it's a profound piece of work. There's 100 different ways that are the right way to use mescaline or psilocybin or any of these things. So the medical route is getting a lot of press, but it's not the only way to do it. And it's not necessarily the best way to do it. Being able, in my research days, people talked a lot about, or they would write a lot about recreational use of drugs. And that was pejorative. That's a bad thing. So medical use of psychedelics is maybe there's a place for that. You have to really fight and yell a lot and argue to suggest that maybe there's a place for medical use of psychedelics, but certainly not that recreational use. No. But I mean, what's recreational use? So let's see. One of my clients took a medium dose of mushrooms and went hiking in the woods. And he was feeling, this was during the debates, the presidential debates. That was a low point. I saw the first presidential debate and I almost had a panic attack. That's just the most horrifying thing I've ever seen on TV. So my client that weekend, or maybe the next weekend, he took a low dose of mushrooms and went hiking in the woods and was able to just reconnect with himself and nature. He was able to feel love emanating from the sun. And there's nothing, that's got nothing to do with a medical model. And in the Psilocybin Services Act that will go into effect in Oregon, it's an open question. We don't know if people will be allowed to go outside or not. But it was absolutely the right way to use mushrooms for him in that scenario, to go hiking in the woods alone. It's not something that I recommended that he do. Probably should have said this earlier, but disclaimer, as a mental health provider, I do not advise or encourage people to break the law. Using mushrooms and going hiking in the woods is illegal, and breaking the law is really bad for your mental health if you're caught. So don't do anything that will make your mental health worse. And going to jail will absolutely make your mental health worse. So, but my client did this totally on his own, and he told me about it afterwards. And there's nothing medical about that, but it was healing for him.
Yeah. What, So the laws in Oregon are shifting, and it sounds like it'll be ambiguous whether or not someone could go outside
Hmm.
and have their psilocybin. What do you think? So as a therapist and with your experience, what do you think the appropriate scheduling and regulation of these drugs looks like? Something like psilocybin.
I believe rather strongly that all drugs should be decriminalized. And so 3 days of the week, I think that all drugs need to be decriminalized. 3 days of the week, I think that all drugs need to be legalized. And then on Sundays, I take the day off and I try not to think about it. But I do not adhere to psychedelic exceptionalism. There's this idea like the decriminalized nature movement. I have a lot of respect for that movement. They're doing some good things, but it's they're saying that psychedelics are the good drugs. Oh, it's not like heroin or crack. Those drugs are bad, but mushrooms are good. It's logically inconsistent. Like to say it's not even decriminalized nature. It's decriminalize these certain parts of nature. They're not saying anything about coca leaves, opium poppy, khat, kratom, any of those drugs. They're just saying psychedelic plants are okay. And that's, not, I don't hold to that. So as far as scheduling, I don't think any drug should be scheduled for any reason.
Interesting. So what do you think what would be the basic, arguments for decriminalization as opposed to legalization versus the other way around? What are the pros and cons of outright legalization compared to decriminalization?
Well, it comes down to regulation. So here in Oregon, we had this great thing where psilocybin mushrooms, so psilocybin services will soon be legally available. And then at the same time, we Measure 110 decriminalized personal possession of all drugs, and that'll come into effect next month, February 2021. So we have two different things going on at the same time, and that's really great. So the pros to decrim, which Portugal did this 12 years ago, something like that, and they've had a great time of it. Oregon, we're going to see what happens, but when you decriminalize things, you take the criminal justice aspect out of it. A lot of the arguments in opposition to the decrim bill in Oregon were that the only way that you can convince people to get help for their addiction is to threaten them with prison. There was this pearl-clutching Mrs. Lovejoy kind of letter that this mom wrote. And she said, won't anybody please think of the children? My children misbehave, and they go out and party, and the only way I can control my children is to threaten them with the police and jail for their drug use. And if I don't have that leverage, then I've got nothing. Which says far more about her parenting than anything else. But threatening people with jail and prison is just not the way to go. Most people who use drugs can use drugs in prison. A significant, I don't have the statistic in front of me, but a significant number of people who use heroin in prison first used heroin in prison. They didn't use it before then. Prison is a gateway drug. Prison is inherent. The prison system in our country is and always has been inherently racist. And adding people to this violent industrial complex is not a good idea for anyone.
Interesting. I actually didn't know that, and I've never heard that prison is a gateway drug, literally, because you can still acquire, I think most people probably understand, you can acquire drugs in prison. That's so embedded in the culture that we put it into movies, in fact. And what you're saying is there's actually a significant amount of people who become drug abusers in prison. So prison is literally a gateway drug for them. Yeah,
or at least, maybe switching from one drug to another, something like that. I mean, in terms of smuggling, you have to, I am by no means an expert of how to smuggle drugs into prison, but I would guess it seems reasonable that volume is of concern. And so cannabis, it's just, it's less dense, it's fluffier. Whereas something like heroin, any kind of white powder, you can just get a lot more of it into the same space. So that's going to be a lot easier to get in. So things like cocaine and heroin are just going to work better in that way. So that is David Nutt's book, Drugs Without the Hot Air. I have read many, many books about drugs in my years, and David Nutt's book is top on the list. And that's he's in the UK. So I don't know about the US prison system, but in the UK prison system, he was the one who wrote that some percentage of people who use heroin in prison first use heroin in prison.
Interesting. And then what would the pros and cons of legalization be? I think the big one is probably, if you decriminalize drugs, you take the justice system out of the picture in the ways that you just described, but you don't actually do anything to regulate the quality of the substances themselves. And that's also, I think, an important piece to this. Yeah.
So again, here in Oregon, we have recreational cannabis where you can just go to any store and you can know I guarantee that this doesn't have mold or heavy metals in it. Now, the testing and reporting system isn't perfect, but it's better than nothing. And you can know this is 20% this and 4% that. And if you just get something from a guy who knows a guy, you have no idea. Which with cannabis, you want to know what you're getting, but it's not as big of a deal. If you're buying a white powder from someone, that could be anything. That could be soap or fentanyl or you don't know what. And you can get testing kits. DanceSafe, I'm going to plug dancesafe.org. You can get testing kits. These are just some kind of qualitative reagent kits. They're not great, but it's accessible for most people. So you can kind of rule out certain substances. But if you think that you're buying a pill of MDMA and you're actually buying a pill of ketamine, you could have a bad time. If you're thinking, I purposefully would like to have a ketamine experience tonight, you will, set up your surroundings in a way to do that. But if you think I'm going to have an MDMA experience, but actually it's ketamine, and you didn't prepare for that, then that is not going to go well. So right before all the stay-at-home orders, I was really excited to see there's a company in Colorado, and they just expanded into Portland, that sells kratom. There's a lot of shops that sell kratom. Kratom, not to go too far into a tangent, but kratom is a plant from Southeast Asia, and it contains some very unique opioid-like chemicals. I first encountered it during my Salvia research days because the chemicals in kratom contain both mu agonist and kappa antagonist properties. Never seen that before in nature. And so very interesting how it can dull pain and help with addiction, but it has less abuse potential because of the kappa effects. And there's no federal laws about it. It's also a state-by-state basis.
So kratom, I've never encountered kratom myself. Is it one drug or is it a mixture? How are people taking this?
It's a plant, and you take you usually buy dried leaves that have been crushed into a powder, and then you can add that powder to food or drink. You can get extracts like with salvia, but it's far less common because you don't really need to. And there are at least 2 alkaloids that have psychoactive and pain relieving properties: mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. But I bring this up because there's this company that I can't remember the name of right now, but right before the pandemic, they opened shop in downtown Portland, and they were selling kratom that was testing, that they had tested, just like recreational cannabis, that you buy kratom and this is 3% mitragynine and 0.5% 7-hydroxymitragynine. Never seen that before. You can't find that online or at any other shop, but this was specifically, we're doing the same kinds of testing as recreational cannabis. And, I can prove to you that my product doesn't have heavy metals or pesticides and that it has a known quantity of active ingredients. And I don't know if they shuttered, if they're still around or not, because, what a terrible time to start a new business, early 2020, a brick and mortar business. But anyway, that's exciting because that's more of the legalization route. And as you were saying, decrim does nothing about purity and potency. Mm-hmm. And legalization, you can do something about that. You can regulate that to make sure that what you're buying doesn't have fentanyl in it.
Mm-hmm. And I think on the legalization side, a lot of people get confused. I think a lot of people hear legalization and they think, oh, that's going to mean that you can buy any drug, anyone can manufacture it and sell it at any corner store. And that's almost certainly not what it would actually mean, right? There's all kinds of things that are legal but don't operate that way. Like cannabis, for example. Not anyone, you have to get a license to grow and manufacture cannabis products. They have to get lab tested at specific facilities, and there are specific stores that sell them. So drug legalization doesn't need to be, Walgreens is going to start carrying bags of heroin. It could mean that, some drugs are legal to sell in some kinds of stores, but anything that is actually going to be put out there has to meet some level of quality control standards that are established by regulators.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of different ways to do it. And then so there are gatekeepers. And sometimes gatekeepers can have a useful role. Sometimes gatekeepers just kind of get in the way and help maintain imbalances of power and authority that don't need to be there. But sometimes gatekeepers can serve a public good of, alcohol is legal and you're not supposed to be able to use it if you're a child, but plenty do. And if you are caught selling to minors, then you can get fined, you can get your license revoked. If you drink and drive a car and get into an accident, you can have your car license revoked, but you don't get your drinking license revoked. You can, no matter how irresponsible you are, you can always buy alcohol, even though it's legal. But there are other things, driving a car is legal, but you can have that privilege taken away again. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different ways to do legal use of something or legal access to something.
Interesting. So we've talked about a lot so far, Peter. So we've talked about, Salvia and various other drugs. We got into addiction, and we got into your clinical or your therapy practice and essentially self-care routines, or at least some of the ones that are out there. Maybe we'll wrap up by just asking you, in the context of COVID, everyone's stuck at home for the most part. People are generally more stressed right now than they have been historically. There's a lot going on in the world that's not helping with that. How do you recommend people stay sane in this current environment?
Yeah, I think that I think about three relationships that we all have. The three most important relationships we have. One is to ourself. So that includes your body as well as your feelings and your thoughts. So foster that relationship. And that could be something like going for a walk or practicing yoga or journaling or just doing things consciously. There's a big difference between I've had a hard day and the world is ridiculous and I want to just, watch a comedy on Netflix for 2 hours. Okay. And that's very different from, whoops, I guess I've been watching comedies on Netflix for 2 hours. How did that happen? I was supposed to make dinner, which, we've all done that. Netflix is great for that. You just sort of get sucked into it, but doing it on purpose is different than it just sort of happening. So your relationship with yourself and just being aware of what you're doing for and with yourself. Your relationship with other people, and that could be family, friends, neighbors, just anyone, just human interaction, which nowadays is in some ways a lot harder. In other ways, it's kind of easier because we're all experts with Zoom and video conferencing now. So it's in some ways it's easier to reach out to other humans, but it's also a lot harder. And then third is your relationship with nature. And so again, going for walks, We are, in fact, allowed to go outside. People like to throw around the word lockdown. I used to work in a lockdown psychiatric hospital. We are not in lockdown. Anyone can leave the house anytime they want. So you can go, even if it's just, if you're lucky enough to have a backyard, you can just go into your backyard if you're able to go to a park or the beach or the river, safely and physically distanced, of course. But just being out in the natural world with fresh air. So your relationship to nature, other humans, and yourself, your own internal process. Those are the three relationships to foster.
All right. Well, Dr. Peter Addy, thank you for taking the time. And I hope to talk to you again at some point.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.